Well, again, thank you for being here. For those of you tuning in online, we're grateful that you are tuning in as well. And today we're going to begin a conversation, a two-part series on the subject of sexuality and God's plan for our sexuality. And in fact, if you're wondering why we're talking about this after Easter, next week, I will tell you why it is actually a perfect time for us to be diving into this topic. Besides the fact that there's just an incredible need, actually, there's an exciting, kind of a cool thing we could know about Jewish culture and religion that would have actually made them think about sex during Easter as well. But I'll leave that for next week and keep you guys very on your seats for that, which I'm sure you already are. I would also just tell you that as we move into this conversation, I realize there's a whole bunch of people here today, and particularly if you have maybe younger kids, I will tell you that everything we're going to talk about today is going to be totally PG related, so no issues there, so you don't need to feel like you've got to run your kids out of here or anything like that. In fact, I would tell you the opposite. It's really good that we are all here today, and I would encourage you as a family, if that applies to you, to use this beginning of this conversation as a springboard for future conversations with your family, particularly with your children. And I would tell you this, parents, the younger, the better, right? If you're not having some kind of conversation about this, I would say we're a little bit behind the 8 ball, in fact. And so I say that just for a little bit of a disclaimer here as well. Today will be a PG-related discussion. But as we start this conversation, you saw from the short introduction video that there was a statement there. It says, sex in a broken world. Now, what I believe to be true, and I don't think you would fight me too hard on this, is that regardless of who you are or what your background is or your spiritual background, whether you're a Christian or not a Christian, I believe that all of us, when it comes to our sexuality, have brokenness at the core. I believe that to be true, and not all of us are broken in the same ways or in the same degrees, but all of us are in desperate need of having our sexuality redeemed by God, which is why I'm really excited about this conversation. Because I believe that God's view of sexuality and the biblical view of sexuality is actually a really good story. It's a story that's needed right now in the church and without the church in our culture. And I believe really that church needs to reclaim our role in the conversation about this topic, because frankly, we've been relegated to sort of a sideline role when it comes to sexuality. And I think the church needs to be at the heart of it, because again, there is good news at the core of this story. So here's the deal, though. I think we need to set the stage for this conversation, maybe give us some context. Because when it comes to sexuality, which, by the way, when I use that phrase, it is a blanket phrase to help us incorporate several different big ideas. And among them are sexual behavior and activity. That's a part of sexuality. Also, our orientation and our preferences. That's a part of sexuality as well. And then finally, even gender. That is an expression of sexuality. And so when I say that, I'm sort of referring to that in the broadest possible sense. And I'll do my best when we talk about something more specifically to do so, to have my language be as precise as possible. But the context of this conversation is changing. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, when I think about 10 to 20 years ago, and I'm now old enough to say 10 to 20 years ago, right? When I was growing up, I remember conversations about sexuality were, of course, happening everywhere, in the culture and even inside the church. But the conversations were very different then than they are now. In fact, what I would say is just a general observation is that over the last 15 to 20 years, perhaps, the focus of the conversation around sexuality has moved from behavior and activity to identity. So when I was young, when we would have a conversation, let's just say in church for the moment, someone would speak about sexuality, or maybe it was the sex talk, or whatever it might have been, and inevitably when we would have questions or when we would be a small group context, the conversation would turn to, well, what is okay? And sometimes they would, I don't know if you ever had this, but they would separate the guys and the girls, right? And you get to go and you get to ask all the questions that you've been waiting for all year, and those middle school boys are like sitting at the front and they're so excited. Sorry, middle school boys, that just is the low-hanging fruit on that. And so the questions would be things like, well, how far is too far with my girlfriend? What activity is permissible? How far can I go before I am sinning? There would be questions for people who had been experimenting sexually. They'd say, well, if I've had, experienced oral sex or been involved in that, am I still a virgin? Is masturbation okay? And so we'd ask questions, but ultimately these were about activity and behavior, which was not so different than what was happening in the culture. If you just think about kind of the early 90s, when it comes to pop culture and entertainment, sexuality was on the forefront. One of the most popular TV shows of all time, which was, well, no, actually, I wasn't thinking about that, but that's actually, I don't know why I didn't think of that. No, Friends. Friends is a TV show about sex. That's all the show's about. It's all about sex. Seinfeld, but you didn't think about Seinfeld. People have done this, and they've posted the results online. They actually found that over 180 episodes of Seinfeld, they just followed Jerry Seinfeld, and they said that he has no less than 73 girlfriends. 73, presumably all of which he's having sex with. So though it wasn't overtly sexual, there was that undertone there. Think about shows like Will and Grace that just tried to sort of be the first shows to explore the question of homosexuality. And is homosexual behavior something that we are going to normalize in our society? But notice, all of these conversations focused around what behavior is okay. But now if you think about the conversations, and if you're paying attention, the conversations have shifted. Really, very rarely now do we talk about sexual behavior. It's almost not an interesting question anymore. The question comes down to identity. We think about this. When people talk about their sexuality, and this is true of heterosexual and non-heterosexual people, we'll talk about that in a second, it comes down to a fundamental question of who you are. Notice that if you're, again, paying attention, you hear terms thrown around these days like, I'm born this way, or God made me this way, and this is who I am. A number of years ago, this was pastoring back at my old church, and there was a lesbian couple that had come to our church, and they started attending, and they were really excited about the church, and I was just getting to know them, and so we went out to lunch one day. And I was just, no agenda, just to get to know them, to say hi. And so at some point in the conversation, one of the gals said to me, she said, well, as a cisgender male, and she said something else. And first of all, I had no idea what that meant at that time. And her partner nudged her. And she said, well, you can't assume that. And by the way, if you don't know what cisgender means that you self-identify as your birth gender. So for me, I am a cisgender male, which means that I was born a biological male, and I identify as a biological male, to which I say, okay, I guess that would be me. But what's interesting is this gal was so concerned that she didn't ask how I self-identified. And I had never been asked that question before. I never necessarily thought about that, but it made me think, oh, this is a bigger question than just who or how I want to express my sexuality with. This is a question of who I fundamentally am. And if that concerns you, if that gives you some angst and just, kind of you're thinking about, oh man, where are we going? I would understand that reaction, but here's, I think, some good news. I think we are getting actually closer to the core of the issue of sexuality. Because sexuality has never been fundamentally about behavior. It is a question of identity. And actually, the culture now has figured this out. And as the church, we've always believed this, believe it or not. We've always believed that our sexuality is tied to our identity. And so here's where the rift is, and the conflict and the tension. The conflict and the tension between a biblical worldview about sexuality, particularly sexual identity, and the culture is that one believes that God defines who we are, He sets our identity, and we live from it. The culture believes that we get to decide who we are and that how our sexual identity and manifestation flow from our identity. And this is a very important thing for us to realize as Christians, because this is the basis of the conversation. And in fact, what we're going to do for the next few minutes, we're going to look at a Bible passage that talks way more about who we are, talks more about who gets to decide ultimately who we are, which then defines our sexuality. And so if you have a Bible this morning, we are going to be in the very first book of the Bible, which is called Genesis. Genesis 1 and 2 are the story of how God, called Yahweh in this story, how Yahweh creates the world. And if you've read the story, you know it's just an absolutely extraordinary picture of how our God, Yahweh, is a creator God, and He creates the world strictly by using His words. He doesn't have to use His hands. He doesn't have to use violence. He simply says, "Let there be light," and it says there was light, and then God looked at it and He said, "That's good." And so God continues to create, and He continues to form things and mold things, and eventually we see that there are plants and animals and land and sea, and we see the world as we know it take shape, which is when we jump into verse 26. And this is where we're going to begin this conversation today. Chapter 1, verse 26 says this. It says, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.' So God created mankind in His own image, and in the image of God He created them. Male and female He created them. God blessed them and said to them, 'Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground.'" Now, you've probably heard this passage, and especially in terms of a conversation around sexuality, oftentimes we want to focus in on this middle part. We want to say, well, yes, in the image of God, He created them, male and female, right? And that's important, but that's actually not what I want to bring our attention to today. So we see in these few verses, we see that God creates humans, but I want to just simply remind us of two things that this passage tells us that humans are not, and then we'll keep moving. The two things that humans, and when we say humankind here, or mankind, we could think about that probably better translated as humans or humankind. So this does not have there's no conversation about men and women thus far. The important thing is God creates humans, but the humans are not two things. First of all, crucially, humans are not God. No one's taking notes. This is actually really important. Humans are not God, but we also see humans are not animals. So just keep that in your mind as we keep moving through this passage. So God creates humans. They're distinct from God. They're distinct from the other animals. And then it says God blesses them, which means that He gives them the capacity to go out and do what God has commanded them to do. That's what blessing means in this passage. Then verse 19, we're going to skip ahead to Genesis chapter 2. And Genesis chapter 2 is interesting because it's a retelling of the story we've seen in Genesis chapter 1. It says, "Now the Lord God had formed out of the ground all of the wild animals and all of the birds in the sky. He brought them to the man to see what he would name them. And whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. So the man gave names to all of the livestock, and the birds in the sky and all the wild animals. But for Adam, no suitable helper was found. Now, so this passage is interesting. You've probably never heard this in the context of sexuality here before, but let me help you understand what's happening. This translation helps you to understand some things that are happening in the original Hebrew language. When you see the word the man, or that phrase the man written down here, the actual Hebrew word is called ha-adam, which basically means the Adam. Adam is sort of a generic term for man in this case. So it says the man, just kind of like that dude. It's Kyle's international version, by the way. And so we see here that this man is sort of a generic sense of the word, but then in verse 20, just notice something really important happens. It says, but for capital A, Adam. And the Hebrew word for that is simply Adam, and we call it Adam. That's how we translate that word. But notice here, the capital A means everything. We see now that Adam is not simply the guy, he has been given a name. And a name is really crucial. A name is the first thing you are given as your identity is being shaped. And so we see that God names Adam. And then what do we see Adam doing in this picture? More fundamental, you might say, well, he's naming animals. Well, actually, he's doing that, but fundamentally, what is he doing? He is bearing God's image. Right at the very beginning of the story, God says, we're going to create humankind in our image. So these humans are going to be unique from animals in that they are an image bearer. And apparently we see, if you're wondering what God, his image is and his nature is, we actually look to Adam. So Adam is bearing God's image, and what is he doing? He's gathering animals around. All the animals come to him, over which he's been already given authority. And this is crucial. God says to Adam, he says, I'm going to tell you to go out and fill the earth, be fruitful, multiply. Then I'm going to tell you to rule over the earth. You're going to subdue the earth, which means that as far as the rest of creation is concerned, Adam, I am making you the boss. Humans are going to have authority over the rest of creation. And so Adam uses his authority over the animals. And as they come to him, Adam says, you are a bear, you are a squirrel, you are a tree frog. And the text tells us that whatever Adam did, and as he exercised his authority, it says that was its name. So when Adam says, you are a deer, you are a deer. Let's keep moving. Identity flows from authority. Then the next few verses, if you skip down with me to verse 24 and 25, this is, again, you've probably heard this one 1,000 times before. It says, that is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. So again, just think about how this whole story has been playing out. God brings Adam, he places him in the garden, he gives him authority. Then Adam shapes the identity of the creation, and then we see Adam being brought back together with his wife. And that's a very interesting, that's a very important progression here. And if you're paying attention, if you kind of have a sense that this last passage, verse 24 and 25, are sexual, you would be right. It's very, very sexual. It says they were both naked and they were one flesh. So let your mind run wild and you're heading in the right direction. So this is a passage about sexuality, and of course it is also a biblical definition of marriage. It's actually the one that Jesus believes, and we'll talk about that next week. But just notice here, we have authority, then we have identity, and then we have sexuality. What they do, what the man and woman do when they come together in a marriage relationship in terms of sex and sexuality, it is defined by their identity, which is ultimately derived from God's authority. God places him in a garden, he gives him a name, he gives them a job to do, and so the sexuality is an outworking of what God has said and the identity that he has given the humans. And so this is very important. And again, you might be saying, well, we haven't really talked much about sex in a sermon about sexuality, but I want to argue that this is absolutely the foundational question and the foundational picture that we have to engage with if we're trying to understand God's view of sexuality. So what we have is God is in authority, he identifies us, he commissions us, and then we go out and we do stuff because of our identity. But let's just, for the moment, think about the cultural conversation that's happening right now. Some of the fundamental beliefs that our culture is buying into and beginning to try to mold and shape our society by. And I think it's interesting. The first thing, remember the two things that God did not create us as. What was the first one? We are not God, and we are not. So here's something interesting. Charles Darwin actually says the opposite. The first thing Charles Darwin kind of thought about when it came to humans and our relationship to the natural world is he came to the exact opposite conclusion. He said, actually, we have a quote from him. He says, this is from his book, The Origin of the Species, or The Descent of Man, rather. He says, there's no fundamental difference between man and the higher mammals in their mental faculties, and all of the differences are of degree, not of kind. Which is to say that you and I are simply higher evolved, more highly evolved chimpanzees and apes. The fundamental difference, because humans and monkeys share 98% of their DNA, so therefore we're basically the same thing. And so, and this is still, when you look at the literature around kind of gender and all this, it all comes back to this idea. As hundreds of years now have passed, but yet we're coming back to Charles Darwin and his idea that humans are basically highly evolved primates. So that's belief number one of our culture, and that's one of the absolute essential presuppositions of the conversation in sexuality outside the church these days. So that's belief number one, is that humans are animals. But then here's the next absolutely essential belief of our culture. It's that humans are God. You see how this works? Humans are animals, yet humans are God. And well, how do you say that? No one's claiming that humans are gods. Well, actually, we are. Because what does God do? Just think about it. Just think about the story we just read. Yeah, God creates humans, but more fundamentally, what does he do? Is he determines their identity. Why is Adam? Well, not to be simplistic, because God said. God said Adam is Adam. God determined Adam's identity, and then his behavior and everything else flows from that identity. Now, in the culture right now, the conversation is precisely this issue. What do you identify as? Right now in terms of gender kind of dynamics and sexuality, also there's the first thing you will read is that, first of all, you get to choose, and it can change. That's the common literature right now. And again, you can look, and this is like scholarly stuff. This is not just people on the internet. These are real sociologists and even medical doctors saying, well, your sexuality, there's a spectrum of things, and you can be here, or here. It can change, but you get to decide. And then notice what happens here. So when we begin, so the culture begins with sexuality. They say, well, I feel this, I think this, whatever it might be, or sometimes it's I don't know. And so then what you do is you fashion your identity based on your sexuality. And then ultimately, do you see how this has happened? Now, my identity is the sum total of how I think and how I feel and how I have determined and how I have fashioned myself. And so this is why I think this question comes back to, who are you? And who gets to decide is actually probably the more precise question. When we come to this conversation biblically, and when we want to address these very pressing, very deep issues that we're trying to experience and these questions we're trying to answer as a culture right now, it actually begins with just a very fundamental question, which is this: are you God, or is God God? And we say, well, and again, when you say it out loud like that, of course, God is God. Or maybe it's not that simple of a question. See, when we say God is God, what does that actually mean? Well, if I say God is God, I am saying I am not. I am saying that there is a power, there's a higher authority that I recognize. If they have higher authority than God, then determines everything else, right? If they can't determine, then it's not God, right? Now, if I say I am God, which is precisely what our culture would have us believe, then far be it from me to ever presume to tell you how you should live, how you should think, how we should act. That is absolutely not my case, because if you're God, you are your God. And so it absolutely is a question about this, because we talk about this, and we begin at somewhere along the line. Christians have gotten so focused on behavior, things that are so far downstream, we've never addressed the fundamental question. Right? We've never decided together that the sky is blue. And so what the Bible tells us, that the basis of sexuality has nothing to do with our behavior as much as it does with who we are and who gets to decide. And so it's a very simple and very basic question. If God is God and you are not, then that means God gets to decide who we are, that God gets to decide what we do, and that God ultimately gets to, remember, bless you for that. And our culture wants to say something else. They say, well, you do what makes you happy. You do what feels right for you in this particular moment. You shape your identity by that, and then ultimately all authority rests with you. And that's simply not the biblical vision of sexuality. And so when we come to this question, next week we're going to ground this a little more in Jesus. We're going to talk about what Jesus actually viewed and what he believed about sex and sexuality and the way that we should live. But today it's just a very simple question. Are you God? Or is God God? Are you willing to submit yourself to the creator of the universe who says, by the way, that he wants to bless you and says that he wants his best for you and wants to see humans flourish, but that there will be certain parameters in which humanity will flourish? Are you willing to abide by those guidelines? Or do we want to say, I am God. I will decide what will make me flourish and what will make me happy? It's a very simple question. I will leave you simply with this. If you believe that God is God, our response must be not just in terms of sexuality, but in terms of every other part of our lives. But sexuality, man, it's a huge one. If you believe that God is God, there is one response, and that is joyful obedience. Notice that is not happy obedience. Notice that does not say, I want you to feel good and whatever makes you feel good. No, I say joyful obedience. So we're going to talk more about what Jesus has to say about sexuality and why I think it's really good news for you. But we have to begin right now with authority. We have to begin with identity. So when you know that God is God and you are not, there is joy, there is freedom when we obey him. Let's bow together and pray this morning. God, we thank you for today. We thank you for an opportunity to come and to remember what you have done through Jesus. And God, we are, on a day like today, I'm just especially reminded of the fact that I'm just grateful for hope. God, I believe that all of us, myself included, have brokenness at our core. That when it comes to our thoughts and our behaviors, and maybe above all our sexuality, there is a fundamental rift. God, because we chose that we wanted to be our own gods, we rejected your authority in our lives. And God, because we rejected that authority, ultimately, we took our identity into our own hands. Each and every one of us in our own way tries to make ourselves our own little god, our own little king or queen. Especially in sexuality. There are so many aspects, God, of my own sexuality that I realize are broken, and that I want to assert my feelings, my values, my desires. But I also have experienced the fact that there isn't blessing when I try to do that. And so today I would just pray for myself, and maybe I can include some of my friends here today. Help me, help us acknowledge that you are God and that we are not. Help us to acknowledge the fact that you love us and that you have your best in store for us. And help us then to submit to your will. And that's so hard in so many aspects, but also when it comes to our sexuality, that feels like such a deep and such a personal part of our identity. And it is, and you made it that way. But God, help us to trust you with that deep part of our lives. Help us to allow your love and your truth to get down that deep in our souls where we say, not what I want, God, but I'll take what you want. And God, that always involves sacrifice. So help each and every one of us to be willing to surrender what needs to be given back to you. And maybe it's a part of our behavior. Maybe it's something we're doing right now that we desire, that we want to do, but we understand that's a broken part of our sexuality. Help us to give that behavior to you. And maybe it's a way that we view sexuality. Maybe it's even as well-meaning Christians, maybe we have started to distort something that you created as good. And maybe we've taken that good thing, we've made it something that's kind of gross. God, I know that's as wrong as having a wrong view of sexual behavior. So help us to reclaim the goodness of sexuality. Help us to realize that it's something to be enjoyed and celebrated and experienced in an appropriate context that you have defined. But God, help us to do it with joy, and help us to experience your blessing when we submit to you. And so we thank you for this good news about sexuality. Pray that you would help us by the power of your Spirit to live in obedience to it this week. It's in Jesus' name we said, amen.